Amina cleaned Según Adebayo's hotels every night, and with her meager earnings, she cared for her ailing mother. He ordered her to be watched, believing she was a thief, but when he crossed the threshold of her home, he discovered his own family had ruined her life. That night, Según Adebayo made the most significant mistake of his life. It wasn't a grand decision, not a signature on a contract or an order in a boardroom meeting. It was something far simpler and much more irreversible. He decided to follow a woman who didn't know she was being followed, to a house he should never have seen. And what he found inside that house destroyed him in a way no business success had ever prepared him for. But that night hadn't arrived yet. First came the call. It was 7:15 inches the morning when Mrs. Folake, the cleaning supervisor at the Adebayo Royal Hotel, dialed her boss's direct extension with a voice that tried to be neutral but didn't quite succeed. "Mr. Según, I need to speak to you about something delicate, about an employee on the 22nd floor." Según Adebayo was 32 years old, bore the most recognized surname in the region's hospitality industry, and had a habit of solving problems before they were fully explained to him. He owned the Adebayo Group, a chain of 5 hotels his father, Chief Adebayo, had built from scratch, and which he had multiplied with a strategic ruthlessness his competitors admired publicly and feared privately. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice because silence already said enough. "Tell me," he replied, without lifting his eyes from the report in front of him. "It's Amina. She's been leaving for weeks with bags that shouldn't be leaving. Items from the storeroom, minibar products, spare towels. Nothing scandalous in one go, but the numbers don't lie, and it always coincides with her shift." Según slightly turned his chair. Outside, the city was already awake, and he hadn't yet had his first coffee of the day. "How long have you been noticing this?" "Almost a month, sir." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" There was a brief but honest pause. "Because Amina is the best employee I have on that floor, Mr. Según. I wanted to be sure before speaking. I didn't want to be wrong about her." That stopped him for a moment. "The best employee I have." It wasn't the description that usually preceded an accusation of theft, but the numbers didn't lie. Neither did Folake. Put her under observation, without confronting her. "Give me a week." He hung up and stared at the report he could no longer read. The days that followed held that peculiar tension that exists when someone observes unseen. Folake sent reports every 2 days. Nothing explosive, nothing definitive, but the patterns remained, with the silent persistence of things that are true. Amina left with bags. Amina lingered longer than necessary near the storeroom. Amina, always punctual, always efficient, always invisible in the way good employees know how to be. She was doing something she shouldn't, or so it seemed. On the 5th day, Según made a decision his advisors would have strongly discouraged. He would go himself, not because it was necessary. He had people for that. He had protocols. He had security. He had an entire system designed precisely for situations like this. But something in him, something he couldn't name at that moment, needed to see with his own eyes where this woman went when she left the hotel. He needed to understand it, not just know it. That seemingly small difference would be what changed everything. Amina stepped out through the service door at 8:16 inches the evening. Según watched her from his car, parked at a sufficient distance not to be noticed. She appeared with her uniform still on, carrying a fabric bag pressed against her side with the gesture of someone carrying something heavy, but who has learned not to show it. She walked directly to the bus stop, without looking sideways, without the tired pace of someone finishing a shift and no longer thinking about anything. She walked like someone who had somewhere to be, like someone with a real, silent urgency. The bus arrived. Según followed in his car. The city changed outside the window in a way Según knew in theory but had never experienced up close. The elegant districts of Ikoyi gave way to the functional mainland suburbs, then to the humble areas, and finally to something that no longer had a polite name. Untarred roads, poles without streetlights, makeshift homes constructed from whatever materials were available when needed, with no plan beyond surviving the next month. Amina got off at an unmarked bus stop and disappeared down a narrow alley. Según parked his car and followed her on foot. He walked through streets his shoes had never touched, feeling something that wasn't fear but resembled it. A physical discomfort of being in a place that reminded him the world was much larger and much harsher than his daily life allowed him to see. The house was at the end of a path that couldn't quite decide if it was a street or a wasteland. It was small, unplastered block, with a corrugated iron roof held up in one corner by a wooden pole. The metal door had a new lock that looked out of place with everything else, as if it were the only new thing Amina had been able to afford in a long time. A single window glowed with light from within. "I'm here, Mama." Amina's voice from inside was completely different from the one she used at the hotel. Softer, more real. It was the voice of someone arriving at a place where she didn't have to pretend anything. The response took a few seconds. It was a weak voice with that tremor that isn't fear but the accumulated exhaustion of a body that no longer responds as it once did. "My child, did you eat anything?" "I ate at work. Don't worry." "Lie," the older voice said with a tenderness that penetrated the walls. "You always say the same thing, and you always arrive hungry. I've known you since you were born, Amina." Segun peered through the gap between the frame and the plastic covering the window, and what he saw was difficult for him to process. On a small bed pushed against the back wall lay an older woman, with white hair, hands resting on the blanket with the stillness of someone who has learned to move as little as possible because every movement costs. Her eyes, however, were alive, dark, and alert, with that intact intelligence that sometimes remains when the body no longer keeps pace. Amina was kneeling by the bed, holding her hands. She examined her arms with a practiced, methodical delicacy, like someone who had learned to be a nurse without anyone teaching her. She adjusted her pillow, touched her forehead, and then opened the bag. It wasn't money. It wasn't anything she could sell. She took out a jar of moisturizer from the minibar of one of the suites, a hand soap from those the hotel placed in premium bathrooms, 2 small towels, and from the very bottom, with almost reverential care, a bottle of antiseptic solution from the 22nd floor storeroom. She arranged them on the bedside table, took the antiseptic, poured a little onto a cotton swab, and gently began to clean a small wound on her mother's arm, where a poorly healed intravenous access line had been. Mama Bola closed her eyes, not from pain, but from relief. "Ah, like that," she murmured. "Your hands always know." Segun felt something within him break without a sound. She wasn't stealing to sell, she was stealing to heal. It was then that Tayo entered through an inner door with a small pot in his hands and an expression too serious for his 16 years. Tall, slender, with his mother's same dark eyes and that way of moving of someone who has learned to occupy little space so as not to bother. "The soup is ready, Mama." "Thank you, my son." "Did you do your homework?" "Almost." "Almost isn't." "Yes, almost is almost," he replied with a half smile that lasted exactly 1 second before turning serious again. "How is Grandma?" "The same," Amina said, and in that one word, there was a weight no teenager should have to carry, and which Tayo carried without blinking, like someone who already knew what it meant, and had decided to keep standing anyway. He approached the bed and kissed his grandmother on the forehead. "Good night, Grandma." Mama Bola took his hand, squeezing it with the strength that remains when there isn't much left. "Take care of your mama," she said in a very low voice. "She doesn't take care of herself." Tayo looked at Amina. Amina looked away. Segun moved away from the window. He walked back to his car with his hands in his pockets and his head down, like someone who had just taken a blow they hadn't seen coming. He sat behind the wheel, rested his arms on it, and stayed like that, in silence, with the city outside making its usual noise, completely oblivious to the fact that inside that car, a 3-2-year-old man was dismantling something that had taken a lifetime to build. All week, he had built in his head the image of a dishonest employee, a woman who took advantage of her position, who abused the trust given to her. He had constructed that image with data, with patterns, with the cold logic of a businessman who knows how to read numbers, and the image was technically correct. Amina did take things from the hotel, but the conclusion was completely, devastatingly wrong. He thought of his father, Chief Adebayo, that man who had built the Adebayo Group from scratch, and who rarely spoke of the people who had been close while he did it. He thought of how many stories like this must have happened in the shadows of that empire while he grew up without seeing them. And for the first time in his life, that ignorance didn't seem neutral. It seemed unforgivable. That night, he didn't sleep. He stayed in his apartment facing the large window, without turning on any lights, letting the darkness be an accomplice to the silence he needed. He thought of Mama Bola and those still hands on the blanket. He thought of Tayo and that soup and that expression that a 16-year-old shouldn't have. He thought of Amina, kneeling by the bed with a delicacy no manual had taught her. And he thought, most of all, of something Mama Bola had said that he couldn't get out of his head. "Take care of your mama. She doesn't take care of herself." How long had Amina gone without taking care of herself? How long had she been carrying all that without anyone in her work environment even asking how she was? 2 years. Amina had been working at his hotel for almost 2 years, and he didn't even know her mother's name. The next morning, Segun arrived before the first shift began. He waited with the door ajar until he heard the sound of Amina's cart moving down the 22nd floor hallway. He stood up, walked to the door. Amina was facing away, preparing for her shift with that silent efficiency he had ignored for 2 years. Precise movements, without pause. The discipline of someone who cannot waste a single minute because every minute outside the hotel is needed elsewhere. "Amina," he called. She turned. Her eyes were dark and calm with the serenity of people who have learned not to anticipate anything good when a superior calls them by name. "Good morning, Mr. Segun." He hesitated for exactly 1 second and said what he hadn't planned to say, what came out before any calculation could stop it. "I need you to come to my office. We need to talk about something important." Amina's eyes didn't change expression, but her hands resting on the cart tensed barely for an instant, just enough for someone who was truly watching to notice. And Segun, for the first time in 2 years, was truly watching. What he saw in those hands wasn't guilt. It was the silent fear of a woman who has built everything on a very thin thread and knows, with that wisdom only suffering provides, that thin threads snap without warning, and when they snap, there's no net below. There are conversations one mentally rehearses before having them. Segun had rehearsed this one while waiting in his office with the door ajar, listening to Amina's footsteps approaching down the hallway. He had constructed an orderly version in his head of what he was going to say, direct, professional, with no room for emotion. He would tell her he knew what she had been doing. He would give her a chance to explain. He would listen. He would decide. That's how things worked in Segun Adebayo's world, with structure, with control, with the necessary distance, so that decisions wouldn't be contaminated by irrelevant emotions. But Amina walked into that office, and something in the rehearsal broke before it even began. It wasn't her expression, no dramatic gesture, or obvious sign of what she carried. It was precisely the opposite. Amina entered with a calm that wasn't indifference but armor. With that straight posture of people who have learned that showing fear only gives more power to those who already have too much. She sat in the chair opposite the desk, crossed her hands in her lap, and looked directly into his eyes. And Segun, who had spent the night constructing arguments, suddenly didn't know where to begin. "Thank you for coming," Amina said finally. She nodded once, said nothing more. She didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. She just waited with a stillness that Segun found more difficult to handle than any direct confrontation. "I need to ask you something," he continued, and his voice sounded more careful than he had planned, as if something in him no longer wished to harm this woman, though he still didn't quite know why. "It's about the bags you've been taking from the hotel." The silence that followed lasted barely 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, Segun saw something cross Amina's eyes. Not panic, not denial, something far more complex and devastating than either of those. It was surrender. The silent surrender of someone who has long been waiting for the moment when everything collapses, and who, when it finally arrives, no longer has the strength to feign surprise. "I know what you're referring to," Amina said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was flat and clear like a still water surface. "I know exactly what you're referring to, Mr. Segun." He waited. She took one breath and spoke. "My mother's name is Mama Bola. She is 71 years old, and for over 2 years, she hasn't been able to walk properly or care for herself. She has an illness that has slowly been diminishing her mobility. First her legs, then her arms, and the doctors say it will continue to progress. There's no cure, only management. And management costs money I don't have. I live with my son Tayo in a house that is barely a house. And between the rent, food, my mother's medications, and Tayo's school expenses, my salary isn't enough. It's not enough even if I work 12 hours. It's not enough even if I haven't bought anything for myself in over a year. It's not enough, Mr. Segun. And when it's not enough, and you have your mother with an infected wound on her arm because you can't afford antiseptic from the pharmacy, you do what you can with what's close by." She paused. She looked at her hands for a moment, as if searching for something in them. "I didn't do it to sell anything. I didn't do it out of ambition or habit. I did it because it was the only thing I had available to prevent my mother from getting worse. And I know that doesn't justify it legally. I know what I did is wrong. But if I had to go back to that moment, with my mother feverish and nothing at home to clean her wound, I would do it again." She looked up, met his eyes again directly. "If you're going to dismiss me, I understand. I only ask that you give me until the end of the month to find another job before it becomes effective. For my son." Segun didn't respond immediately. He was processing something that went beyond the words he had just heard. He was processing the way Amina had said them. Without pleading, without drama, with the intact dignity of someone who has made difficult decisions and is willing to take responsibility for them, even if they cost her everything. "How many years has your mother been ill?" he asked, and his voice sounded different, even to himself, less like a boss, more human. Amina blinked. Clearly, it wasn't the question she expected. "Almost 3 years, she replied after a moment. "It started with her feet. We said it was tiredness, that it would pass, but it didn't. It progressed slowly, and by the time the doctors named what she had already lost significant mobility. Now she spends most of her time in bed. She can sit up with help, she can move her arms a little, but she can no longer walk. She probably won't be able to again." "Who looks after her when you're at work?" "Tayo. My son is 16 and knows what to do if she needs something urgent. I've left him the number for the doctor at the neighborhood health center, and a neighbor who sometimes checks in, but basically, it's him. A 16-year-old teenager looking after an ailing elderly woman while his mother works 12 hours. Segun let that settle in silence. "And does she have regular medical follow-ups?" Amina hesitated for barely a second. The kind of hesitation that reveals an uncomfortable answer. "We had appointments at the public hospital every month, but I cancelled the last 2 because transportation cost more than I could spend that day, and I needed that money for medication. Dr. Adebola, who attends to her, told me she should come even every 6 weeks. That follow-up is important to adjust doses, but between knowing what you should do and being able to do it, there's a distance that sometimes can't be crossed." Segun slowly stood up. He walked to the window and stood looking out with his hands in his pockets. His back was to Amina, not because he was evading the conversation, but because he needed a second where she couldn't see his face, because his face at that moment wasn't the face of a businessman managing a human resources problem. It was the face of a man being shown something that had always existed very close to him and that he had preferred not to see. "How long have you been working here, Amina?" "Almost 2 years, sir. And before here, I worked in other hotels, always in cleaning. Before that, when my mama could still move, she also worked. She worked in family homes. She had many years in that job." Segun turned slowly. "In family homes," he said. It wasn't a question. It was something between an affirmation and the beginning of something larger he didn't yet know how to name. "Yes," Amina replied. And something in her tone changed in an almost imperceptible way. A slight new caution in her words. Like someone walking on familiar ground, but knowing it might give way. "In what area of the city?" Amina looked at him for a moment before answering. "In several, but most of her life she worked in Ikoyi." Segun knew that area very well. It was the neighborhood where he had grown up. "In which homes?" he asked, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. Amina took a breath, and in that moment, in that breath, Segun had a physical certainty, before the words even arrived, that what he was about to hear would change something that couldn't be changed back. "Most of the time," Amina said, with a calm that cost too much. "She worked in a single home, almost 20 years. She arrived when I was little and continued until her illness no longer allowed her to. She was the family's trusted staff. She knew every corner of that house. She knew the children. She watched them grow." A pause. "It was your father's house, Mr. Segun. My mother worked for Chief Adebayo for almost 20 years. The silence that fell over that office was different from all previous silences." Segun didn't move. He said nothing. He stood by the window, processing information that suddenly reorganized every element he thought he had clear. Mama Bola, a woman he had never put a face to, whose name he had never heard spoken in his childhood home with any special weight. She had spent almost 2 decades in that house. She had known his family, had known him probably as a child, and he had no way of understanding what it meant for someone to spend 20 years of their life caring for another's home. "Did I know her?" he asked in a low voice. Amina nodded. "You were small when she started. I imagine you don't remember her." Children often don't remember the household staff in the homes where they grow up. Not because they are bad children, but because no one teaches them how to truly see. There was no accusation in those words. They were just an observation. An observation that entered Segun like a fine needle and stayed there. "Why did she stop working for my father?" he asked. "It was because of her illness." Amina looked at him for a moment that lasted a little longer than necessary. "That," she finally said, "is something I'd prefer you ask your father directly." And in that response, in that polite but firm refusal to elaborate, Segun heard something that made his skin prickle. It wasn't evasion born of fear. It was the deliberate restraint of someone who knows a truth heavy enough to choose carefully when and how to release it. There was something more to that story, something Amina knew and wasn't going to say for now. They remained silent for a few seconds. Outside the office, the hotel continued to function at its usual rhythm. Carts in the hallways, elevators, distant voices, the normal world of any Tuesday, oblivious to what was happening inside that room. "Amina," Segun said finally, "you're not going to be dismissed." She showed no immediate relief, only looked at him with that expression he was beginning to recognize, that of someone who has learned that good news almost always comes with a catch. "The salary you have now is not enough for what you're carrying. As of this month, it will change, and your mother's medical expenses will be covered by the company as long as you continue to work here." Amina opened her mouth. She closed it. "Mr. Segun, I didn't come here to ask." "I know," he interrupted her. "You're not asking. I'm offering it to you. And there's an important difference between the two." She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since she had entered that office, something in her face changed. It wasn't a smile. It was something smaller and harder to sustain than a smile. It was the briefest gesture of someone who has carried so much alone for so long that receiving help feels almost harder than continuing to carry it. "Why?" she asked in a low voice. "Why are you doing this?" Segun took a moment to respond. He could have said something corporate, something about corporate responsibility or employee welfare policies. He had that vocabulary available, and it would have been easier to use, but he spoke the truth. "Because last night I saw how you cleaned your mother's wound with what little you had. And because I realized you've been working for me for 2 years, and I didn't even know her name." Amina didn't respond. She lowered her gaze to her hands for a moment. Those hands Segun had seen tense on the cart that morning, and which now lay still in her lap with a different quietness. Less defensive, barely more rested. "There's something I need you to know," Amina said without yet looking up. "Something about my mother and about this company that will come to light sooner or later anyway. And I prefer that you know it from me before you discover it another way." Segun slowly sat on the edge of the desk. "I'm listening." Amina looked up, and in her eyes was something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't surrender. It was the quiet determination of someone who has finally decided the time has come to tell the truth. Even if it hurts. Even if it changes everything. Even if there's no way yet to know if what comes next will be better or worse than what was before. "My mother didn't stop working for your father just because of her illness," she said. "They let her go. And the way they did it after almost 20 years is something you need to know, because it has to do with who your father is and who you have been without knowing it." Outside, the hotel continued its Tuesday rhythm. Inside, something was about to break forever. There are questions one avoids asking their father, not because they don't want to know the answer, but because somewhere deep inside, they already suspect the answer will force them to see that man in a different light. And seeing your father in a different light is one of those pains no one prepares you for, because the world assumes fathers are what they appear to be, and very few people talk about what happens when you discover they aren't. Segun Adebayo was 32 years old, and had never asked Chief Adebayo a question his father didn't want to answer. That was about to change. After Amina left the office, Segun remained motionless for several minutes. The conversation had ended with that hook suspended in the air. That phrase Amina had dropped with the precision of someone who knows exactly the weight of what they release. It has to do with who your father is and who you have been without knowing it. It wasn't an accusation. It was something more difficult to handle than an accusation. It was an invitation to open a door that had been closed for years, without knowing what was inside, knowing only that what was inside had been waiting a long time to come out. He cancelled his afternoon meetings, something he had never done for personal reasons in 2 years of managing the hotel group. His assistant looked at him with a surprise she tried to conceal, but didn't quite manage. Segun gave no explanations, took his car, and drove for 40 minutes to the house where his father had lived all his adult life. The same house where he had grown up, in Ikoyi, with its natural stone walls and a garden that someone always cared for with a dedication Segun had never thought to thank anyone for. Chief Adebayo was 68 years old, and had the build of a man who had worked with his hands before learning to work with his head. Short, broad-shouldered, with that completely white hair he'd had since his 50s, which gave him a visual authority he never needed to cultivate because he already possessed it anyway. He was in the back garden when Segun arrived, sitting on a wooden chair with a coffee in his hand and the newspaper folded on the table, looking towards the trees with that expression of older men who have learned to be still without stillness, disturbing them. He looked up when he heard his son's footsteps. "I wasn't expecting a visit," he said. "It wasn't a reproach. It was an observation." "I know," Segun replied. "I need to talk to you about something." Chief Adebayo looked at him for a moment. That gaze of his that didn't evaluate but weighed, that measured things before deciding what to do with them. "Sit," he said. Segun sat opposite him. He didn't accept the coffee his father offered with a gesture. He went straight to the point, because with Chief Adebayo, beating around the bush didn't work, and he had known that since he was a child. "Do you know a woman named Mama Bola?" His father's reaction wasn't dramatic. There was no startle or sudden change in expression. It was something far more revealing than all that. It was a sudden stillness, the specific stillness of someone who hears a name they immediately recognize and who, in the next second, decides how much they will show. "Why do you ask that?" Chief Adebayo said, and his voice sounded the same as always, but something in the rhythm was different, very slightly, just enough for Segun, who had grown up learning to read that man, to notice. "Because her daughter works for me. She's been at the hotel for almost 2 years, and this morning I found out that Mama Bola worked in this house for almost 20 years. Chief Adebayo looked towards the trees, took a sip of coffee, and set it on the table with a calm Segun, recognized as the same calm his father used in difficult negotiations. A calm that wasn't peace, but control. "Rosita," he finally said in a low voice. And in that diminutive, there was something Segun didn't expect to find in his father's voice. A different texture. Something very much like nostalgia, that Chief Adebayo clearly had no intention of exhibiting. "How is she?" he asked. "Badly," Segun replied without softening it. "Her daughter looks after her alone. She's frail. She can't move well, and until this morning, she had no adequate medical cover. Amina had been taking antiseptic and cleaning products from my hotel for months to treat her wounds, because she couldn't afford to buy them." Chief Adebayo didn't respond immediately. He kept looking at the trees, and Segun saw something he had never seen on his father's face in 32 years of life. He saw him register the blow. He didn't show it as another person would. There was no visible gesture or dramatically changing expression, but there was something in Chief Adebayo's eyes, something very brief and very deep that resembled pain, real pain. The kind of pain that comes from knowing something one did or failed to do had consequences that reached much further than they allowed themselves to imagine. "Why did she stop working here?" Segun asked. And this time his voice wasn't that of a son asking an uncomfortable question. It was that of a man who needed an answer and wouldn't leave without it. Chief Adebayo set his coffee on the table, leaned back slightly in his chair, and for a moment Segun thought he would evade the question, with his ability to turn any difficult conversation into something that ended up being about something else. But he didn't. "The company was going through a complicated period," he said. "A few years ago, you were already at the helm of the group, but I still handled some administrative matters for the house. Cuts had to be made. Rosita had been here for many years, and her salary had adjusted over time. She had accumulated benefits, seniority. On the balance sheet, she was a significant expense." Segun stared at him. "You dismissed her for money?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement said in a low voice, with that surgical precision simple truths sometimes have when spoken without embellishment. Chief Adebayo didn't respond immediately, and that silence was more eloquent than any answer. "She had been in this house for almost 20 years, Segun continued. 20 years, Dad. And you let her go as if she were an expense on a spreadsheet?" "It wasn't that simple," Chief Adebayo said. And for the first time in the conversation, his voice lost some of its characteristic solidity. There was a proper severance. All processes were followed. "Processes?" Segun repeated. "That's what matters, that the processes were correct." Chief Adebayo then looked directly at him with that gaze that, since childhood, Segun had found the hardest in the world to meet, because it was a gaze that neither asked nor gave permission for anything. It simply was. "What matters," Chief Adebayo said with a calm that was now harder to maintain, "is that at that moment I made a business decision, as I've made thousands of business decisions throughout my life. Some turned out well, others, with time, I see differently." "You see this one differently?" A long pause. "Yes," Chief Adebayo admitted in a very low voice. "I see this one differently." It was the first time in Segun's life that he heard anything resembling regret in his father's voice. It wasn't an apology. Chief Adebayo didn't apologize, but it was the recognition that something had been wrong and that something had had a real cost in a real life, and that cost hadn't been abstract or statistical, but concrete and human, and had a name. Mama Bola Rosita, The woman who had spent almost 20 years in that house and who was now in a bed she couldn't leave, being cared for by a daughter who stole antiseptic from a luxury hotel because it was the only thing she had available. "There's something else you need to know," Chief Adebayo said after a silence that weighed between them like something physical. Segun waited. "When Rosita started working here, you were 8 years old. She stayed until you were 27. 19 years. Not 20, but yes, almost 2 decades. And in that time, Segun, that woman wasn't just household staff in this house." "What do you mean?" Chief Adebayo took his coffee, looking into the cup as if searching for words there. "When your mother left, you were 11 years old. Rosita was in her early 40s set. And during the years that followed, while I tried to maintain the business and raise a son alone and not fall apart, Rosita was the person who truly held this house together. Not just cleaning it, but sustaining it. She was here when you came home from school. She fed you when I worked late. She knew when you were sad, even if you didn't say it. She knew you in a way that I, in that period, couldn't afford the luxury of knowing you." Segun felt something stir in his chest, something from a long time ago. "I remember her," he said in a low voice. And it was true. Until that moment, he hadn't connected the name with the face, but now he did. A woman with dark hair that slowly turned gray over the years, who always had something warm in the kitchen, who never raised her voice but had a way of saying things that made you listen. A constant, silent presence in the most difficult years of his childhood. So constant and so silent that he had grown up without thinking of her as a person with her own life, with a story, with a daughter also growing up somewhere, while her mother cared for another's home. "I remember her," he repeated, "and I didn't know her name until today." Chief Adebayo didn't respond, but something in his posture changed. He settled differently in his chair, as if the weight of what he carried had suddenly redistributed itself. "Does Amina know all this?" he asked. "Does she know her mother worked here? What I don't know is how much Rosita told her about those years, or how much she knows about the way she was dismissed." Chief Adebayo closed his eyes for a moment. "There was something else," he said. "Something that isn't in any severance paper." Segun waited without moving. "When I made the decision to let her go, Rosita had been having the first symptoms of what we later learned was her illness for months. I knew it. She had told me because we were close enough for her to tell me. And even so, I made the decision because the numbers didn't add up, and I needed to resolve that. And at that moment, I was able to separate what I knew from what I decided." The garden was completely still. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. "You dismissed her knowing she was ill," Segun said. And his voice came out so flat, so without inflection, that it was more devastating than any shout. Chief Adebayo opened his eyes. They were shining in a way Segun had never seen before. "Yes," he said. A single word, 3 letters. And in those 3 letters was a confession Chief Adebayo had carried for years in silence, with his way of carrying things, which was never to speak of them, and to keep moving forward, as if forward motion could compensate for what had been left behind. Segun slowly stood up, not abruptly, not with visible anger. He stood up like someone who needed to put distance between himself and what he had just heard, to process it without breaking right there. He walked to the edge of the garden. He stood with his back to his father, looking towards the same trees Chief Adebayo had been looking at when he arrived, and thought of Amina, in that office that morning, with her hands still in her lap and her voice unwavering, telling the truth, even if it cost her everything. He thought of Tayo with his pot of soup and his 16 years carrying what wasn't his to bear. He thought of Mama Bola with her lively eyes and hands on the blanket, and that phrase she had said to her grandson, "Take care of your mama. She doesn't take care of herself." And he thought of himself, of the 32 years he had lived within that surname, as if within armor, never asking what lay beneath the decisions that built that name, never asking who had paid a cost for what came to him as inheritance. He turned to his father. "I will take care of Mama Bola," he said, "of her treatment, her medications, everything she needs, and I will do it not as a favor, but as what it is, a debt. A debt this family owes that woman, and which should have been paid years ago." Chief Adebayo looked at him for a long moment. "I know," he finally said, letting those 2 words say everything he couldn't say otherwise. Segun nodded, took his car keys, and before leaving, paused for a moment. "Does she know where you live?" he asked. "Does Rosita know you're still in this house?" Chief Adebayo took a second. "I don't know. Probably. Rosita always knew everything that happened in this house. It was her way." Segun looked at him once more, and in that gaze was something new, something that hadn't been in any of the looks he had directed at his father in 32 years of life. It wasn't hatred, It wasn't simple disappointment. It was something more complex and more mature than either of those. It was the gaze of a son who had just seen his father for what he truly was. Not the invincible man of childhood, nor the relentless businessman of adulthood, but a man, with all that word contained of greatness and failure, of real achievements and errors that couldn't be undone, but which perhaps, if one was brave enough, could still have consequences that mattered. He drove back to the city with the window open, letting the air hit his face, thinking that the next day he had to speak with Amina again, that there were things she needed to know, and things he needed to tell her. That the history between these two families was longer and more entangled than either of them had imagined that morning in the office. And also thinking of something he couldn't get out of his head. Mama Bola had spent 19 years in that house. She had watched him grow up. She had been present in the most difficult years of his childhood after his mother left, when Chief Adebayo worked non-stop, and the house truly needed someone to hold it together. And her daughter, without knowing exactly all of that, had ended up working for him. It wasn't a coincidence. Segun knew it. Things like that are never a coincidence. They are the result of decisions made years before, of paths crossing, because life has that relentless way of closing circles that people leave open. The circle had been open for years, waiting for someone to have the courage to close it properly. And Segun Adebayo, for the first time in his life, felt that someone had to be him. There are things mothers keep to protect their children, not out of cowardice, not out of weakness, but because there exists a kind of love that calculates, that measures, that consciously decides how much weight a person can carry before that weight breaks them. And mothers who have seen their children suffer develop a fierce instinct to detect that limit and not cross it, even if it means carrying alone things that shouldn't be carried alone. Mama Bola had kept many things for many years, but that afternoon, when Segun Adebayo knocked on her door, she knew the time for keeping them was over. Amina wasn't there. She had gone out to run some errands that couldn't wait, and Tayo had opened the door with that teenage expression that calibrates in milliseconds whether the visitor represents a threat or not. When he saw Segun, the calibration was evident. It wasn't fear. It was the reasoned distrust of someone who has learned that men in expensive clothes appearing at their door generally don't bring good news. "I'm Segun Adebayo," her mother's boss said. "Is your grandmother in?" Tayo looked at him for a moment, longer than strictly necessary. Then, he opened the door wider. "She's inside, but she gets tired quickly." He followed him down the short hallway to the room where Mama Bola spent most of her hours. In daylight, the house was different from how Segun had seen it at night through the window. Smaller, in a sense, more real. Light entered through a side window, illuminating details the darkness had hidden. A shelf with 3 well-read books, a framed photo on the bedside table, a small plant on the windowsill that someone carefully watered because it had the healthy appearance of things that receive attention, even when everything else is scarce. Mama Bola was sitting up, propped against the headboard of the bed with 2 pillows behind her. Her eyes were open when Segun entered, and the second she saw him, something in her face made a strange movement. It wasn't exactly surprise. It was something closer to recognition, as if she had been expecting this visit. Not today specifically, but at some point, on some day she knew would eventually arrive. "Segun," she said. And she didn't say Mr. Segun or Mr. Segun Adebayo. She just said his name, like someone naming a person they've known for a very long time, even if years have passed without seeing each other. He stopped at the threshold, looked at her, and suddenly, with a clarity he hadn't had when his father pronounced the name that afternoon in the garden, he truly recognized her, not as a concept or as a story he had been told. He recognized her in the deep, physical sense of when the body remembers something the mind had filed away long ago. This woman had been in his kitchen, in his hallway, had been present on mornings when he came down for breakfast, and his father had already left, and the house was silent. And she would put something warm on the table without saying anything, without asking how he was, because she had the wisdom to know that sometimes children don't need questions, but simply someone to be there. "Mama Bola," he said, and his voice came out lower than he intended. "Sit, my son. Don't stand in the doorway." No one called him my son. It had been years since anyone had called him that. The word reached him in an unexpected way. With that capacity, simple words have to open doors one thought were locked shut. He sat in the chair Tayo had pulled closer to the bed without being asked. The teenager stood in the doorway, not fully entering, but not leaving either, watching with that silent loyalty of children who have grown up being the only man of the house. "How are you?" Segun asked. Mama Bola made a gesture with her hand that meant more or less, That meant within limits. That meant exactly the same thing Amina said when asked how she was, and replied that everything was fine. "How much did your father tell you?" Mama Bola asked. "Enough," Segun replied. "He told me he dismissed you knowing you were already ill." Mama Bola nodded slowly, without drama, with the serenity of someone who has had a long time to make peace with something. "Your father is a complicated man," she said. "He's not bad. I want you to be clear on that. Chief Adebayo isn't bad, but he learned very early that feelings come with a cost, and in business, what costs must be eliminated. The problem is that over the years, that crept into other parts of his life too. And sometimes, he could no longer distinguish where business ended and everything else began." Segun listened without interrupting. "When he told me he no longer needed me," Mama Bola continued, "I already knew what I had. The doctors had explained to me how it would progress. And, yes, it hurt. I'm not going to lie and say it didn't hurt. 19 years in a house leaves roots, even if you don't want it to. But what hurt me most wasn't losing the job." She paused. Her hands moved slightly on the blanket. "What hurt me most was thinking of Amina, of how she would carry all that alone, because Amina has always been like that since she was little. She takes the world on her shoulders and says nothing. She smiles and keeps going. And I knew that when I could no longer work, she would do exactly that. Take the world on her shoulders and smile and keep going." "Does she know how you ended up in my father's house?" Segun asked. "Does she know the complete story?" Mama Bola looked at him for a moment. "She knows I worked there for many years. She knows I was dismissed. What she doesn't know is everything else." "What is everything else?" The room was very quiet. Tayo remained in the doorway. The plant on the windowsill received the last light of the afternoon. Mama Bola took a deep breath and began to speak. "When I came to work in that house," she said, "you were 8 years old, and your mother had not long left. The house was dim. That's the only way I can describe it. Your father worked from dawn to dusk, because work was the only way he knew not to think. And you were a child coming home from school to a silent house, searching in the kitchen for someone to see you." Segun said nothing, but something in his posture changed. "I remember the day you arrived with a broken school bag," Mama Bola continued. "You were about 10 years old. You had sewn it yourself with kitchen thread because you didn't want to bother your father with something so small. I saw it and didn't say anything that day. But the next day, a new school bag appeared in your room. Your father never knew where it came from." Segun closed his eyes for a moment. "I bought it," Mama Bola said simply, "with my salary for that week, because no child should arrive at school with a school bag sewn with kitchen thread, and also carry the weight of not wanting to bother anyone." The silence that followed was one of those that didn't ask to be filled. Segun had a very vague memory of that school bag. He hadn't thought about it in over 20 years, but now that Mama Bola named it, something returned. The color, the smell of newness, the feeling of carrying it the next day, not fully understanding where it had appeared from, but feeling, for a reason he couldn't then name, a little less alone. "Why did you never tell me who bought it?" he asked. "Because I didn't do it for you to thank me," Mama Bola replied with a naturalness more powerful than any solemn declaration. "I did it because it was what needed to be done. Simple as that." Segun looked at her. This woman who had spent 19 years in his house, who had bought a school bag with her own salary for a child who wasn't hers, who had held together a house that wasn't hers, and who had finally been dismissed when she could no longer work well, and the numbers didn't add up. "Is there anything else that—" "I don't know," he asked. And something in the tone of the question indicated it wasn't casual, that he had arrived in that room with the suspicion that the story had more layers than his father had shown him. Mama Bola looked at him for a long moment. "There is one thing," she said. "One thing Amina doesn't know, and I think it's time she knows it, and you too." Segun waited. "When I was dismissed, I was entitled to a full severance package. 19 years of service. Your father offered me an amount that didn't correspond to that time, significantly less. And I, who was already sick and scared and alone, signed. I signed because I needed something immediately, and because at that moment I didn't have the strength to fight." Mama Bola's voice didn't tremble, but her hands did, barely, almost imperceptibly, but Segun saw it. "Amina never knew that," she continued. "I never told her how much I was entitled to, or how much I received. I told her they had given me what was fair because I didn't want her to carry that anger, because anger weighs heavy. Segun. And Amina already carried enough." Segun slowly stood up, walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon was closing, and the streets of that neighborhood filled with that particular noise of humble districts at the end of the day. A noise that mixes life with weariness, in a way wealthy neighborhoods never do. How much was the difference? He asked without turning. Mama Bola told him a figure. It wasn't a fortune in absolute terms, but in terms of what that woman needed at that moment, in terms of what it would have meant for Amina in the following years, in terms of the medical treatment that couldn't be paid for, and the appointments that were cancelled because transportation cost too much. It was a difference that had had real and concrete consequences in every difficult day they had lived since then. Segun turned. Do you have the severance agreement? Mama Bola pointed to the shelf with the 3 books. Behind the second one, folded with the precision of important documents kept without quite knowing why, but unable to be discarded, was an envelope. Tayo reached it before Segun finished asking. He handed it to his grandmother, and Mama Bola passed it to Segun without saying anything else. He opened it, read it, and as he read, he felt something that wasn't exactly anger, because anger implies surprise. And he was no longer surprised. It was something colder and more determined. It was the clarity of someone who had just fully understood the magnitude of what needed to be corrected. He folded the document, put it in the inner pocket of his jacket. This will be corrected, he said. The difference, the interest, everything. And it will be in your account before the end of the week. Mama Bola looked at him. You don't have to do that, she said. I know, Segun replied. That's why I'm going to do it. They fell silent for a moment. Outside, a key was heard in the lock, footsteps in the hallway, and then Amina's voice from the entrance. That voice Segun now recognized as the real one, the one she used at home, the one that had none of the professional correctness of the hotel. I'm home. How are you all? She stopped at the bedroom door when she saw Segun. The expression on her face was a mixture of things that happened simultaneously and were difficult to separate. Surprise, alarm, a question she didn't know how to formulate. And beneath all that, deep inside, something that resembled the fear of someone who discovers that 2 worlds they had carefully kept separate have just collided. Mr. Segun, she said. What are you doing here? Segun looked at her, then looked at Mama Bola. And in the exchange of glances between mother and daughter at that moment, there was an entire conversation without words. One of those conversations that only exist between people who know each other so deeply that language becomes unnecessary. Mama Bola nodded slightly towards her daughter, a small gesture, but Amina understood. Sit, my daughter, Mama Bola said. Mr. Segun and I have been talking, and I think it's time you also know some things I kept from you to protect you. Amina looked at her mother, then at Segun, then back at her mother. And she sat with an obedience that wasn't submission but trust. The trust of a daughter who knows that her mother, even if she has kept things, has never kept anything that wasn't out of love. What came next would change everything Amina thought she knew about her history, about the Adebayo family, and about the debts that exist between people long before those people know they have them. Amina listened to everything without interrupting. That was what impressed Segun most about her at that moment. Not the tears, though they came, not the trembling in her hands, though it was there, but that ability to remain completely still while the world she thought she knew reorganized before her eyes with the same silent discipline with which she had faced everything else. Mama Bola spoke slowly, without drama, with her way of saying difficult things that made them both softer and more devastating, because they didn't come wrapped in scandal, but in pure truth. And pure truth, without wrapping hurts in a particular way that has no antidote. She told her everything. The 19 years in the Adebayo house. The years after Segun's mother left, when the house needed someone to hold it together, and she did it without anyone formally asking her because it was what needed to be done. She told her about the 8-year-old boy who came down to breakfast alone and about the school bag sewn with kitchen thread. She told her how she had watched Segun grow up from the distance of someone who is present without belonging, who cares without the care belonging to her, who loves without the love being named, because in those houses, the love between staff and family doesn't have a comfortable name. And then she told her about the severance. Amina said nothing when she heard the figure. She just closed her eyes for a moment, and in that moment, Segun saw something on her face he recognized, because he had seen it before, in his father's garden that same afternoon, when Chief Adebayo registered the blow without fully showing it. The pain of understanding that something that hurt a lot, something that was carried for years, believing it was the normal weight of life, actually had a concrete origin, a decision, a person, a specific moment when someone chose convenience over fairness. Mama, Amina finally said. Her voice was very low. Why didn't you tell me? Mama Bola looked at her with that serenity only people who have thought much about an answer before having to give it possess. Because I've known you since you were born, my daughter, and I know that if you had known I was dismissed like that, ill, with an incomplete severance, you would have carried that anger every day of your life. You would have carried it while you worked, while you cared for your children, while you cared for me, and that anger would have weighed more on you than anything else. I preferred to keep it myself rather than let you carry it." Amina opened her mouth, then closed it. Tears ran silently, without sobs, in the way people cry who have learned to weep without making a sound so as not to scare anyone. Tayo, who had been in the doorway all that time, slowly approached and sat on the edge of the bed next to his grandmother. He took her hand without saying anything. And that simple gesture, that 6-year-old teenager, holding the hand of his ailing grandmother amidst a truth that surpassed him in years and in weight, was what finally broke Amina's composure completely. She covered her face with her hands and wept. Not the contained weeping from before, but true weeping, the kind that comes out when one no longer has the strength to keep being strong, the kind that accumulates months and years of carrying alone and smiling and saying everything is fine when nothing is entirely fine. Segun said nothing. It wasn't the time for words. It was the time to let that family have what they needed to have, even if it was painful, even if it cost, because there are pains that cleanse, and there are truths that, even if they arrive late, arrive when they are meant to. It was Mama Bola who broke the silence, doing so by looking directly at Segun with those dark, lively eyes she hadn't lost despite everything. "You are not your father, Segun," she said. "I want you to know that. Chief Adebayo made decisions that were not right, but you are a different man. I see it in why you are here today. I see it in how you look at my daughter when you think no one is watching you." Segun didn't respond, but he didn't look away. Amina lowered her hands. She looked at him with eyes still wet, and that expression of someone who has just gone through something and doesn't quite know which shore they landed on. "Why did you come here today?" she asked. "To this house, to speak with her. Why didn't you send someone, or call by phone, or simply deposit the money and close the case?" Segun thought for a moment about the answer and chose truth over comfort. "Because 2 nights ago, I was outside this window," he said. "I saw you cleaning your mother's wound with what you had. I saw Tayo with his pot of soup and understood that I had been running a company for 2 years without knowing anything about the people who made it run. I came because I needed to face this head on, not from outside a window. Head on." The room was completely still. Mama Bola squeezed Tayo's hand. Amina looked at him with an expression that blended gratitude and a distrust that hadn't quite dissolved yet, because reasoned distrust doesn't disappear suddenly, even if it wants to. And Segun understood that. He didn't expect it to disappear suddenly. Some things rebuild slowly, or not at all, and the only thing one can do is be consistent and let time do what words cannot. He stood up, took the envelope from his pocket, and left it on the bedside table next to the framed photo. "The difference from the severance, plus the interest for all these years," he said, "will also be deposited into your account on Monday. This is just the confirmation." Mama Bola looked at the envelope. She didn't take it immediately. "Thank you," she finally said, with the same naturalness with which she had said everything else. Without exaggeration, without breaking down, with the intact dignity of someone receiving what was always theirs, and who didn't need to make a show of it. Segun nodded. He looked at Amina once more. "Tomorrow we'll talk further. There are still things to resolve." She nodded, and as he headed for the door, her voice stopped him. "Segun." It was the first time she had called him by his first name only, without Mr., just his name, as his mother had said it when he entered that room. "Thank you for coming," Amina said. "For truly coming." He didn't respond. He walked out onto the street, where night had fully fallen, and walked to his car, thinking that phrase, so short and so simple, weighed more than any contract he had signed in his life. For truly coming. How many times had he been present in a place without truly being there? How many conversations had he had without truly listening? How many people had been close to him, working for him, sustaining him without his knowledge, without him asking, without it occurring to him that behind every name on a payroll, there was a story that deserved to be seen. He started the car and knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that what had begun that night outside a window hadn't ended yet. It was just beginning. Days later, Amina's life began to change in a way she still didn't know how to name. It wasn't sudden, not dramatic or cinematic. It was slow, like the changes that endure, with that discreet solidity of what is built well from the foundation and doesn't need to make noise to prove it's real. The first thing that changed was Mama Bola. Dr. Adebola arrived at the house one Tuesday morning with his black briefcase, and that way of entering humble spaces without making people feel observed. He was a man in his 50s, slender, with thin-rimmed glasses, and a permanent expression of someone who has seen too much avoidable suffering and has decided that the only possible response is to keep working. He had been attending to Mama Bola for years at the neighborhood health center, with the limitations of a system that always had less than it needed and more patients than it could properly care for. But that morning, he arrived with something different. He arrived with time, with complete diagnostics Mama Bola had never been able to get, with an order for a specialist at the private street, Helen's clinic, that would cover everything the public system couldn't. Segun had managed it without announcing it, without calling Amina to tell her what he was doing, or expecting gratitude. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, and because he had learned in the days following that night outside the window that actions done expecting recognition are not generosity, they are disguised transactions. Dr. Adebola examined Mama Bola with a thoroughness she hadn't experienced in a long time. He adjusted her medications, patiently explained what each one did and why it was important to take them in the correct order. He spoke to her as one speaks to an intelligent person who deserves to understand her own situation, not as one speaks to an ailing elderly woman who only needs to obey instructions. When he finished, he went out to the hallway where Amina waited with Tayo and told them something neither of them would forget. "Your mama won't regain the mobility she lost," he said, with that direct honesty. "Good doctors don't avoid. Even if it hurts, that won't change. But with the right treatment and proper follow-up, what she has doesn't have to progress so quickly. We can give her years of stability, and those years, with the care you provide, can be good years." Tayo looked at the doctor, then at his mother. And in that look was something Amina recognized, because it was the same thing she had felt when Segun left the envelope on Mama Bola's bedside table. It was the relief of knowing that someone else was bearing some of the weight. Later, when Dr. Adebola had left, and Mama Bola slept with that new tranquility that comes from knowing someone competent is looking out for you, Tayo sat next to his mother in the small living room and asked something he had been wanting to ask for days. "Mama, is Mr. Segun a good person?" Amina took a moment to respond. "I think he's learning to be," she finally said. "And sometimes that's worth more than being born one." Tayo processed that in silence. Then he said, with his way of going straight to the heart of things, "And my father, was he also learning when he left?" The question arrived without warning and with its full weight. Amina let it settle before responding, because it was a question that deserved a real answer, not a comfortable one. "Your father," she said slowly, "was a man who wanted to be better than he could be. He left when you were 3 years old because he was lost in things he couldn't handle alone. Not because he didn't love you, but because sometimes people drown, and instead of asking for help, they disappear. It's the saddest mistake a person can make. Do you miss him?" "Sometimes I miss what could have been," Amina replied honestly. "Which is different from missing the person." Tayo nodded slowly, and then did something that took Amina completely by surprise. He leaned against her shoulder with that affectionate awkwardness of teenagers who don't yet know how to fit into their own bodies, but who, once in a while, need to simply be children. Amina hugged him and said nothing more because it wasn't needed. Meanwhile, at the Adebayo Royal Hotel, other things were also changing. Missus Folake received Segun in her small supervision office with that expression of someone who has been awaiting a conversation and doesn't know if what she's about to hear is good or bad. Segun went straight to the point. "Amina remains in her position," he said. "With a salary adjustment you will see reflected in the next fortnight. And I want you to know that what you found and reported to me was correct. You did well." Folake looked at him. "May I ask what happened?" "What happened is that numbers don't always tell the whole story," Segun replied. "And that I took too long to understand that." There was a pause. "And the storeroom key?" Folake asked. "Because I still don't understand that. Amina didn't have authorization to have that key." Segun had thought about that. He had spoken directly with Amina 2 days prior in a brief, straightforward conversation. "The key," he explained, "was left by a previous shift employee who resigned 4 months ago. Bayo Dunbello, do you remember him?" Folake frowned slightly. "Yes. He left without notice. He left without returning the spare storeroom key and simply gave it to Amina, telling her to keep it until someone claimed it. No one claimed it, and when Amina needed what she needed, the key was there." Folake processed that in silence. "So, she never had real authorization," she said. "She never did," Segun confirmed. "But she also didn't actively seek it. It was a chain of administrative oversights that ended in a situation neither of us intentionally created. As of this week, key return protocols will change, and the storeroom inventory will have a daily logging system that we will implement on all floors. Folake nodded. And then, with that direct honesty, Segun had come to value in her. She said something else. Mr. Segun, Amina isn't the only employee in this hotel carrying difficult burdens alone. There are others. Segun looked at her. I know, he said. That's why I want you to help me put something together, a staff welfare protocol, not just on paper. A real one, with follow-up, with resources, with someone who listens before situations reach the point Amina's did. Folake looked at him for a moment with an expression Segun couldn't quite read. Then she said, I've been waiting years for someone to propose that, so let's start this week. Days later, Segun did something he hadn't planned, but felt necessary, with a clarity that allowed no postponement. He went to see his father. Chief Adebayo was in the same garden as always, in the same chair, with the same coffee, but something about him was different, something very subtle, almost imperceptible, that Segun identified after a few seconds. He was waiting, not with anxiety, but with that specific stillness of older men who have learned that certain conversations arrive when they are meant to, and the only thing one can do is be present when they do. Segun sat opposite him. I deposited the difference from Mama Bola's severance, he said, with the corresponding interest for all these years. Chief Adebayo nodded slowly. How is she? Stable. She has medical follow-up now. The treatment is adjusted. Good, Chief Adebayo said. And in that single word was a relief that had had nowhere to go for years. There was a long silence between the two. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that exists between people who have said important things and are still processing the weight of having said them. I want to ask you something, Segun finally said. Chief Adebayo looked at him. I want you to go see her. The silence that followed was different from all previous ones. Heavier, more laden with things neither of them could fully name. I don't know if she wants to see me, Chief Adebayo said. You won't know until you go, Segun replied. His father looked towards the trees for a long moment, and then, with that economy of words that had characterized him all his life, he said, Give me a few days. Segun nodded, stood up, and before leaving, paused for a moment with his hand on the back of the chair, without fully turning. Dad, the school bag, the one Rosita bought you when you were 11, she told me. Chief Adebayo looked at him with an expression Segun had never seen before. It wasn't yours, Chief Adebayo said in a very low voice. It was mine. I was 11 when I lost my mother. Rosita worked in my parents' house at that time. She bought me a school bag when mine broke, because no one else noticed. Segun remained still. I've known all my life what that woman did for me, Chief Adebayo continued. And even so, I made the decision I made. That's what I find hardest to forgive myself for. Not that I did it unknowingly, but that I did it knowing perfectly well. Segun didn't respond. There was no possible answer to that. Only the naked truth of a man facing the most difficult mirror there is, that of his own contradictions. He walked out to the garden where the afternoon was slowly falling, and walked to his car, thinking that the history between these two families was much longer and more entangled than he had imagined when it all began with a call from Mrs. Folake one Tuesday morning. And also thinking that the most important chapter of that story had not yet been written. Chief Adebayo arrived at Mama Bola's house one morning, when the sky was cloudy and the streets of the neighborhood had that particular silence of days that seemed to know something important is about to happen. He didn't give notice beforehand, didn't call, he simply appeared. As people do who know that, if they think too much, they won't go. Tayo opened the door and recognized him without ever having seen him. He had Segun's father's face, serious and broad, with that white hair that apologized for nothing. The teenager stood for a moment in the doorway, calibrating. I've come to see Mama Bola, Chief Adebayo said. With his permission, Tayo let him pass without saying anything, but he stayed. Mama Bola was sitting on the bed with the pillows arranged behind her back, as if she knew she was going to receive a visitor. When Chief Adebayo entered through the door and she saw him, there was no startler, no drama. There was simply the silent recognition of two people who have carried a common history for years and who are finally in the same room to face it. Adebayo, she said. Rosita, he replied, and in those two words were 19 years, a school bag, an incomplete severance, guilt and gratitude and lost time, and things that weren't said when they should have been. Chief Adebayo sat in the chair by the bed, without taking off his jacket, like someone unsure if he had the right to get comfortable. I came to ask for your forgiveness, he said. No beating around the bush, no prepared speech. I know there's no way to undo what I did, but I needed to tell you that, while looking you in the eye. Mama Bola looked at him for a long moment, with those eyes that had lost nothing despite everything. Do you know what weighed on me most all these years, Adebayo? It wasn't the severance, it wasn't the money. It was knowing that you knew exactly what I had done for you when you were a child, and yet you still chose what you chose. Chief Adebayo didn't look away. He received that as someone who knows they deserve it, and has decided once and for all to stop running. I know, he said, and I lived with it. Mama Bola took a deep breath. I forgave you a long time ago, Adebayo. Not for your sake. I forgave you because resentment would have weighed more on me than on you. But forgiving doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It means I chose not to let your decision define the rest of my life. Chief Adebayo closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, there was something in them Segun had never seen in his father, and which Tayo from the doorway observed with that silent attention of young people who are recording everything without adults realizing it. It was a man facing the most honest reflection of himself. Without armor, without the weight of the surname, just an older man looking at the real consequences of a wrong decision and accepting that there was no way to go back, only to move forward. I want you to know, Chief Adebayo finally said, that what my son is doing was not my idea. He came to this on his own, and that tells me that somewhere, amidst all the wrong I did, something remained right. Mama Bola looked at him for a moment, and then did something no one in that room expected. She smiled. Not a polite smile, a real smile, with that specific tenderness of people who have suffered greatly and have learned that life is too long to hold it all for pain. You were always too stubborn to be entirely lost, Adebayo. Chief Adebayo let out a breath that carried more than just air. And for the first time in that whole story, the man who had built an empire with his own hands seemed simply human. Tayo quietly left the doorway. Some conversations belonged to those who lived them. Weeks later, Amina was in the same 22nd floor hallway when Segun appeared with 2 coffees in his hands. And that expression she had learned to recognize as that of someone who has something to say but doesn't quite know where to begin. She stopped the cart. He extended one of the coffees. She accepted it. They sat on the steps of the service staircase because the 22nd floor was silent at that hour, and sometimes the most important conversations happen in the least formal places. Segun took an envelope from the inner pocket of his jacket and handed it to her without preamble. Amina slowly opened it, read it, and stared at the paper for several seconds with an expression. Segun didn't try to decipher. He let her take the time she needed. It was a proposal not of charity, a real proposal, with a contract, with a salary, with concrete responsibilities. Amina would become the coordinator for the Adebayo Group's new staff welfare protocol, working directly with Mrs. Folaka and the Human Resources Department. Her duties included identifying situations of vulnerability within the team, creating real listening channels, and ensuring that no employee reached the point she had without someone knowing. This is a real job, Amina said. It's not a disguised favor. It's a real job, Segun confirmed. Because you are the only person in this company who knows exactly what the world looks like from the other side. And that knowledge is worth more than any qualification I could hire. Amina carefully folded the paper, put it back inside the envelope, and looked down the empty hallway with that expression of hers, of someone processing something massive without letting the massive break her. I'm going to need to study some things, she said, to do this properly. I've already thought about that, Segun replied. The company covers it. You choose the course, the schedule, the format. And Tayo enters the scholarship program we are structuring for employees' children. When he finishes secondary school, he has guaranteed access. Amina closed her eyes for a second. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. She closed her eyes like someone who needs an instant to contain something too vast to fit on their face without overflowing. When she opened them, she had her usual composure, but there was something different about her. Something Segun noticed but didn't name, because some things work better without a name. It was the beginning of rest, not happiness, because happiness doesn't arrive all at once, but rest. The feeling that the weight was still there, but for the first time in a long time, there was more than one pair of hands holding it. Why are you doing this? She asked. And it wasn't the same question as before. Before, it held distrust. Now, it was genuine. Segun thought before responding and chose the most honest answer he had. Because a woman I failed to see spent 19 years caring for my house, without me even knowing her name. And when I finally opened my eyes, I understood that the problem was never her. It was the size of my blind spot. Amina looked at him. And why? He continued. You said something I can't get out of my head. You said I had truly come, and I want to continue being the kind of person who truly comes. I don't know how to do it perfectly, but I know I don't want to go back to being what I was before." The hallway was quiet for a moment. Then, Amina did something simple that was worth more than any speech. She raised her coffee cup towards him, like a toast, small, almost imperceptible. Segun touched her cup with his, and they remained like that, sitting on the steps of a service staircase, drinking cold coffee in a silent hallway, like two people who had weathered the same storm on completely different paths, and who now, finally, were on the same side. That same afternoon, Amina arrived home and found Tayo sitting at the table with an open notebook, and that expression of concentration she recognized as her own, when something had moved him inside. "What are you writing?" she asked. "A letter," he said without looking up. "For my father. Not to send, just to write." Amina stood for a moment, then went to the kitchen, prepared 2 teas, came back, and sat beside him. She said nothing, didn't ask about the content, she just was there. And that was enough. As almost always with Tayo, enough was simply being there. Mama Bola slept in the next room, with that new tranquility, the correct treatment had returned to her. On the bedside table, the envelope with the confirmation. On the shelf, the 3 well-read books. In the window, the plant someone always watered. And throughout the house, there was something unseen but felt, the sense that the worst was over. Not because life had suddenly become easy, not because the debts of history had been fully paid, because some debts are not paid with money or intention, only with time and consistency, but because the truths that needed to be spoken had been spoken. The people who needed to truly see each other had finally seen each other, and the hands that had carried alone for too long finally had a place to rest. Sometimes, that's what life needs. Not perfection, not grandiosity, just the courage to cross someone's threshold, to look head-on at what's on the other side, and to decide to do things differently. Segun Adebayo learned that one night when he stood outside a window looking into a house that wasn't his, Amina learned that asking for help isn't the end of dignity. It's the beginning of a greater dignity. Mama Bola already knew it, always knew it. And Tayo, at 16 with a letter that would never be sent, was learning the hardest lesson of all, that carrying the past isn't an obligation, it's a choice, and that at some point, when a person is ready, it's possible to gently set it down, take a deep breath, and move forward with free hands. Because free hands are not empty hands. They are hands ready to build something new. The end.